finally, I had the resources and the incentives, both intrinsic and extrinsic, and a little bit of time without too many stressful things. I was able to utilize that proactively, because if I didn't do it at that point, I don't think I was ever going to be able to do it. It was do or die for me.
I think it's important for people to know that you should vision cast for yourself. If a life beyond alcohol or addiction is something that you decide you want, and also to know that it is something that you have the capacity to do.
Thanks for tuning in to the Elevation Recovery Podcast, your hub for addiction recovery strategies, hosted by Chris Scott and Matt Finch.
Welcome to episode 228 of the Elevation Recovery Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Finch, joined today again with Chris Scott after I did a solo cast last time on failing forward, which was a really fun topic for me to teach based on John C. Maxwell's book, Failing Forward. And before that, Chris and I did an episode on the four burners theory, which was really fun. And this one kind of goes along with it. We're going to be talking about incentives, extrinsic incentives and intrinsic incentives, what those are, how you can incentivize your recovery or incentivize other goals. For example, if you've been listening to this show for a while and you've been learning a lot, but you just haven't been able to make the type of progress that you've wanted to, whether you haven't been able to detox if you're dependent, or whether you haven't been able to stay alcohol free if you drink sometimes, but you want to quit, whether you haven't been able to, overcome anxiety getting through post-acute withdrawal and haven't really kind of doubled down on that action plan, whatever it is, this is going to be a really, really fun episode. You're going to get so much value from this. I did a bunch of research because I've been thinking about this topic a lot lately, and Chris's finance background with being in finance and knowing about tax incentives and stuff. So that's just some examples we can give. And then, even though most of incentives about things like compensation, tax benefits, social incentives, these kinds of things, you're going to learn how to translate these incentives and this incentivization system over to addiction recovery and over to really any goal you want to achieve. If you haven't been able to make progress on it, this one's for you. So thanks, Chris, for joining me on this fun-ass topic we're about to do.
Yeah, I'm excited to be back with you. I've got a new little podcast studio for anyone watching on YouTube. I think I may have used this in the last episode or even the episode before that, but I didn't announce it. And so you might see some people walking their dogs behind me. I figured the more green, the better. I liked my other setup, but time for a change. And I also appreciate that you introduce all of the episodes that I'm in, Matt, because I never know what episode number it is. I suppose I should learn in advance which episode, how many hundreds of podcasts we've done, so that I have an incentive to actually take some initiative there and be proactive. But anyway, it's always good to talk with you. And I think this is a great subject because one of the things that I've been thinking about lately is how people tend to focus so much on the costs or the so-called negative consequences of drinking or using drugs, and they don't focus as much on the benefits. And I know we touched on recently, or maybe it was during my conversation with Zach a few weeks ago, we were talking about how if you can visualize the bright and promising future that you have in detail, if you can visualize your perfect day, not just some vague picture of like, oh, my family would like me and I'd have a job or something like that. But if you can visualize from start to finish, from dawn to dusk of your perfect day beyond alcohol or beyond addiction, then you have something that, unfortunately, in my experience, I think I can say 90+% of people who are trying to beat addiction don't have. And that was something that I kind of stumbled into by default because I was writing my lists. I've always been the psychologist where I went to rehab said I had a compulsive personality type, which doesn't sound particularly flattering or encouraging when you're in there for addiction. I'm just going to be a compulsive forever. But apparently, I don't even remember what test that was, but apparently it means I like to write lists. I keep track of things. I guess you could say in some ways I'm type A, although I think I've tempered that over the years, become a little more laid back, probably following your example in some ways with that. But I wrote a lot of lists, and I tried to figure out, what are my priorities? What are the things that I want to do in the short term and in the long term? What do I want my perfect day to look like? And it was things like rock climbing, there was a rock climbing gym in Atlanta, which was where I was when I quit drinking. And I'd never gone to it, and I'd meant to go for over a year. And I figured, well, at least now that I quit drinking, I can go to the rock climbing gym and not worry about drinking or going through withdrawal while I'm there, which would not be fun. So it's like I framed that as a benefit, as an incentive to keep doing what I was doing. And I think it's not enough to have negative incentives. You have to have positive incentives. So in the long term, one of my goals was to start a business. I knew that I was not a good fit for finance, which was a tough realization because I'd spent, over half a decade of my life doing finance, and which is not that long by some measures, but at the time it seemed like I'd been doing it forever. And so it was intimidating. It was daunting to try to embark on some career change. And of course, when I announced to my family and friends that I was going to try to start a business, they recoiled in horror and started sending me random odd jobs that they found as listings online. But I had an idea of what I wanted to do in the long term, and lots of little ideas about what I wanted to do in the short term. And those were the incentives for me that I personally created. Again, not necessarily by my own virtue or discipline, but maybe because I have a compulsive personality type and I had to write these things down. But for those of you out there who don't have that personality type, I can say that it is a good way to incentivize yourself to do things, especially if you can harness your imagination and your ability to visualize the future, so that you can see a different path from just going back into vicious cycles and old habits as something that's superior and something that is incentivizing for you.
Love it. That's a great place to launch off. And especially, I'm so glad that you brought up lists, because it just so happens that I've got a big, huge double-sided list here. I'm not going to read it all verbatim. I'm going to read some of the stuff and then use it as notes. I also wanted to mention, Chris, how awesome that not only your new setup looks, but how great that mic sounds closer to you this way. It's just, that's a crisp, and we got the same mic, of course, we're matching. It's the same mic that Joe Rogan uses, although instead of USB input like we do, he does it, the external drive with the sound processing and the digital parameters. But anyways, we'll start off with this.
Maybe next year. But someone in the comments had told me that, or had said that my sound quality was not excellent, or the lighting, which I concurred with. And that was part of my rationale. Actually, there were a couple comments to that effect. So I want to make sure everyone can hear me, especially since I don't hear well myself. So hopefully this is better for people.
So we've been doing this for more than 2 years. It's been 2 years as of July 1st this past summer. So now we're moving on to coming up on fall in just a couple of weeks. This is September. That means that it's National Alcohol and Drug Addiction Recovery Month. So I'm excited to launch this off in September and talk about addiction and recovery. First, let's talk about what is an incentive. Well, it's a noun, and it's a thing that motivates or encourages a person to do something. Another way you could say it, a payment or concession to stimulate greater output or investment. There's really a few different types of incentives, but just to keep it basic, Chris, you were saying positive incentives and negative incentives. That's just another way of saying intrinsic incentives would be the positive ones. Those come from within. So a person with intrinsic motivation, they wants to do something for their own sake. So when you were, going rock climbing and a lot at the beginning, you had a lot of intrinsic. I'm not sure if there was any extrinsic motivation, lots of intrinsic. For myself, I had a combination of both. And for me, it was actually the extrinsic incentives that were the main reason I was able to quit. But intrinsic motivation. So it's doing something for its own sake. Now, an example of this would be something like, for me, when I was addicted to drugs, when I was addicted to alcohol, I looked horrible. I looked absolutely, especially when I was drinking, especially when I was the one summer where I was doing lots of methamphetamines, smoking meth and smoking crack and drinking alcohol. As you can imagine, I didn't look too good. I was really skinny. bony. In fact, I looked like a tweaker, and my skin was horrible. I was hunched over. It was not a good look. So a lot of my past intrinsic incentives were kind of vain. They were kind of from like low self-confidence. I didn't look good doing, if I looked really good doing the drugs and alcohol and was able to still look healthy and confident and fit, there wouldn't have been as much of a drive to quit. I still would have had a drive to quit, but interestingly enough, I really just hated how I looked so much that was a big part of it. Then there's intrinsic or extrinsic incentives. That involves providing a material reward like money for accomplishing a task, or threatening some punishment for failure to do so. So when I finally quit almost 10 years ago, and I won't go long into this story, you guys have heard it a million times, but it was a combination of intrinsic incentives, wanting to get my health better, physical health, spiritual health, emotional health, social health. I wanted to look like at least average. I didn't want to look just horrible. Just, you could tell that I wasn't taking care of myself, and that reduced my perceived value of myself, my internal value. And then there was also really powerful levels of extrinsic, these words are tying me up, extrinsic incentives. My parents saying, hey, you can live here, room and board, rent free, we'll feed you and everything, help you with childcare. You don't have to get a job right away, but you can't be drinking and you can't be doing drugs. So unless I wanted to be homeless, and they were also said that they were going to try and get custody of my daughter if I relapsed back into addiction. So that was some huge extrinsic leverage right there. Leverage is the way I used to call it. You know, when someone gets leverage against you, when they threaten to, if the courts threaten to take custody of your child, or if your spouse threatens to divorce you if you don't change your ways, if you don't stop drinking, for example, or if you don't stop using drugs. So really, you know, it's more fun if you can do it all with your own intrinsic motivation and intrinsic incentives. Examples of that too, tax incentives. There's financial incentives, moral incentives, I think is a big one, and social incentives, Chris, and then I'll let you take off after this. Social incentives to be accepted and fit in. So there's also incentives that can work against us. For example, when you're going out to a party, when you're going to a family gathering, maybe your family and loved ones drink alcohol and they love it and they can handle themselves maybe, or maybe if they even can't. But then if you're trying to quit drinking, or if you've recently quit, even within the 3-6 months, a year or something, the social incentives to drink and to fit in and to avoid getting stigmatized or ridiculed, either the person saying something or they don't say anything, but you can tell that that's what's going on in their mind. That could be a huge reason. In fact, I know it is a huge reason for a lot of people. It certainly was for me. There was huge social incentives for me to drink and for me to use drugs if I wanted to be tight and accepted by the crew that I was in back in those days.
So I feel like I can say from my experience seeing this kind of thing that extrinsic incentives in the absence of intrinsic incentives doesn't work. I've seen a lot of people whose spouses really want them to change. And actually, I've heard from a lot of spouses or parents who simply want their spouse or their children or child to enroll in my online course. And sometimes they bought it for them. They're ready for them to go. You can't force someone to even look at a course, and so there's some extrinsic motivation. And sometimes it's like, they need to take your course and get better, or else I'm kicking them out, and they still won't do it. So, and at that point, I can't do anything because I'm not physically there. We do online recovery. We do phone calls with people for coaching, but an online course is, if you don't want to log into your computer, there's a problem. The course isn't going to help you if you don't see it. So, sometimes it's absolutely baffling what people will allow themselves to lose when there are all of these things stacked against them. I've seen people lose their whole families and go to jail even. And it's almost like they don't care. And, Zach had, actually, it wasn't Zach. I believe, let's see, this might have been Kyle from Sober Dogs who told me, that he was actually in solitary confinement in prison for, I suppose, drugs. And he was in there for close to a year. And when he got out, he immediately went back to drugs. So you would think that being put in solitary confinement would be enough extrinsic motivation or coercion. I guess that's the worst kind of extrinsic motivation, right? Because you can have someone—
That's punishment.
say, yeah, it's punishment.
Negative reinforcement.
Exactly. You'd think, but it's still extrinsic incentive in a way. It's that's what punishment or coercion is. And it didn't work for him. He went out of solitary confinement, right back to drugs, even while he was in prison. So there has to be some ability on the part of the individual to take that extrinsic motivator and translate it into an intrinsic motivator and say, all right, I have all this stuff that I'm going to lose, or I have all these things that people are offering me, in which case it's not punishment, but it's still extrinsic motivation. Like your parents, you can live in our house, you're free of rent, but don't drink or do drugs. So you can say, I have all these things. And then the task is, how do you figure out how to want it for yourself? And those extrinsic motivators can play a role in building intrinsic motivation, but I think that translation has to be there. It's because pressure on the outside of your consciousness can build up to extreme degrees. If it doesn't permeate in and become something you participate in, then I don't think it becomes a motivator for action.
I'm thinking of so many examples now. What you just said, all those things right there, made me think of a bunch of things in Hollywood. I don't know why I started to think about Hollywood, but there used to be a show. I'm not even sure if it's still on air anymore. It probably isn't. I forget the name. It's Celebrity Rehab. I think that was the name, Celebrity Rehab with Dr. Drew. And so this was like this rehab, either somewhere in Hollywood or close to it, right? Where a lot of famous people are actors, musicians, artists of that type. And so these famous people would go in there. A lot of the times they'd get sent to this rehab. They'd agree to do it. It was usually extrinsic. Can't even think of the word now. Incentives, extrinsic. So Charlie Sheen, he wasn't on that show to the best of my knowledge, but in one interview I saw with him maybe 9 months ago or something, when he first got addicted to drugs and alcohol, and he was so famous, he was like, it was after Platoon and maybe after Wall Street. He was just so famous and just, oh my gosh. And I think he was undiagnosed bipolar too. He would get so out of whack on cocaine and alcohol and, hookers and drugs and all sorts of stuff that he would not be able to do another movie. He wouldn't be able to get a movie part. His manager that was working with him and all the people in this industry, he'd say, listen, man, we can't rely on you. You're unreliable. We need somebody reliable to do this. However, we love you so much. We want you for this movie. We want you for this part. We want you for this lead role or supporting role, but you have to go do 30 days of inpatient rehab. And so he was also a people pleaser, which he stated. And so he'd be like, he wanted to please his dad, Martin Sheen. I just saw a movie with him last night, which was phenomenal, called, I think, The 12 Mighty Orphans, based on a true story. Really, really inspiring. But Martin Sheen, so his dad, his girlfriend or wife at the time, and his managers, everybody was saying, you got to go do this. So he was a people pleaser, and it was powerful, incentives, extrinsic. So he'd go do it, and he'd be good for just a little while. And then as soon as they'd get off of his back, as soon as he did the rehab, okay, got the movie over with, then he said it was his time to go back and party. With the show also, Intervention, which that's one of the main reasons I wanted to become a drug and alcohol counselor, was watching this show Intervention. I think the channel's A&E. It's also on Amazon and online. But all the people on that show, they might have wanted to quit, but they didn't. Most of them didn't want to quit super bad. None of them, I think, that I saw at least, wanted it a 10 out of 10. So they'd get these interventionists to come in. They would, the people that were addicted to drugs and or alcohol, they would get proposed to be in this documentary type thing. And maybe they paid them for it too or something. And so the cameramen and women would follow these drug users, alcohol users around while they're drinking, while they're using. It was like very intense stuff. I used to love watching it. It can trigger a lot of people because there shows them shooting up, shows them getting hammered. It's like very triggering for a lot of people. But then all of a sudden they think they were going in for their last interview for the documentary. They come into this hotel room or some other type of small room somewhere. There's their family members and a professional interventionist. My favorite was James Van Vonderen. And dude, almost every time they'd either deny it, like I'm not going to go to rehab. So they'd have negative consequences. They'd have even more extrinsic incentives. We're going to kick you out of the home if you don't quit. I'm not going to give you money for drugs anymore. Each family member would say how much they love the person. And these are going to be your incentives to do this, because otherwise you're not going to get all these benefits we've been giving you. We're going to cut you out of our life forever. Then the interventionist would kind of, talk to them about it and try to convince them, hey, we're going to pay for this treatment. It's usually like 90 days treatment center, inpatient. We're going to get you to detox and inpatient. But then even a lot of times they'd run out of there or they'd say, no, no, no. But even many of the times that they said yes, they'd go to treatment. They did it because they felt like trapped, like they had to. Then it would show them relapse. Like 2 weeks later, they'd leave rehab, get on a bus, meet up with somebody and start using. So I just went off on a long tangent, but I really wanted to hammer home for however many family members of addicted loved ones are out there, or spouses, boyfriends, girlfriends. Like Chris was saying, they really have to want it for themselves. If they don't want it for themselves at very high levels, then it's probably not going to work. If you threaten to leave them, that kind of stuff, at times it does work, but they also have to want it for themselves. Otherwise, if they don't want it for themselves, it's typically just a matter of time before the addictive pattern starts going in again.
Yeah, I think there's a lot I could say about this. I had so many ideas when you were talking.
I saw you thinking a bunch of.
Yeah, I had about 50 different ideas at various points while you were talking. So I'll try to zoom in on a couple of them. But all I can say is, in my experience, I quit when I was ready to quit. And I was so good at hiding my drinking from family and friends that it came as a shock to people that I was going to quit. I had people say, "Are you sure? I'm pretty sure you're fine." Like, no, I've been drinking over a liter of vodka, well over that, for some time now. I'm like, whoa, really? So, I just become good at hiding the drinking. And I quit. Well, I guess you could say that fearing the health consequences of alcohol, in a sense, that's extrinsic, because I didn't have control over it. I didn't want to be afraid, but I couldn't help the fact the universe coerced me, in a sense, with my swollen liver, which I could, if I pressed right below the right side of my rib cage, I'd be reminded of, and just being foggy brained and having cold sweats and withdrawal and shakes. So in a sense, I'd put up with that for quite a long time. That should have been enough if we frame that as extrinsic motivation, even if I'm the only one who knew about it. Extrinsic motivation from the universe, that should have been enough to get me to quit, because it was horrific. But I went on for years like that with varying degrees. And so I think it's important that for people for whom an intervention is staged, and I can tell you, if someone had staged an intervention for me, I probably would have felt a combination of relief and resentment and anger and joy all at the same time. And I'm not sure, I haven't run that scenario in my mind to know what would have happened. But I can tell you that I can understand people who will acquiesce the people who stage the intervention, their family and friends who they do care about. And maybe in that moment, they do want to change. But if in the overall scheme of their life, alcohol or drugs still fulfills a profound need, if biochemically it helps to temporarily and artificially rebalance their brain chemistry, if psychologically it is something that they absolutely need in order to regulate their daily thought patterns, if socially it's something they believe they need to maintain their social identity, and if spiritually they're not developed enough to have some alternative to guide their life, then a 20-minute or 3-hour intervention is not going to be enough to change them. They might believe sincerely that they have enough to change from that extrinsic motivation because it's uncomfortable, but afterwards it would seem natural to me that they might feel some resentment. So that's the first thought. And resentment, as AA knows, is fuel for going back to old behavior. And so I think it's kind of ironic that you often have 12-step treatment centers that are filled with people who have been court ordered to attend. And yet one of the sayings there is you have to want it for yourself. And so, well, all right, if that were the case, then people would be going of their own volition. Of course, they're going to have some inner, maybe even repressed and subconscious rage towards the courts or the parents or the people who sent them there. So I think it is, I'm not making an excuse, and I'm not trying to, say that people should never quit if they're not ready. All I'm saying is that the reality of the situation is that people will not sustainably quit if they're not ready. And so rather than an intervention, and I have nothing against intervention coaches or people that do that, I think it can probably be more artfully done in some cases. And maybe it can be useful to spread awareness to the person who may be acting or living unconsciously. They're like, hey, here are the effects of what you're doing, and here's how we feel about it. Maybe it becomes something like a heart-to-heart that does give them a profound spiritual shift. So that would seem to me to be an ideal strategy. And what I was going to say is, if I had a close friend or family member who was clearly struggling with addiction, maybe on the verge of dying or killing someone else, through an accident, and I wanted to help them change, I would keep in mind that the intrinsic motivation has to be there. I can't directly provide it, but maybe we can have a heart-to-heart. And maybe that can, at least I can see if there's some spark there spiritually for them in wanting to change for themselves.
Oh man, beautiful, beautiful. Yeah, there's just so much evidence at this point that, unless somebody wants it, like a 10 out of 10 intrinsic motivation. And this goes along with neuro associations too, which we've talked about, but I'm not sure if we've done an entire episode on it. And so, it's the pain pleasure principle. As complex as we are, supercomputer brains, eternal souls, really complicated systems. There's just so much going on. But, if you look underneath everything, a lot of what drives our behavior primarily is avoiding pain, moving away from pain, and moving towards pleasure. And so if a person on drugs and or alcohol, if their motivation, if they're linking like a 10 out of 10 pleasure to drinking and a 1 out of 10 pain to it, there's no intervention in the world that's going to stop them, because they're barely getting any negative consequences, barely any pain from it. That's how I was when I first started partying, when I was in my, probably early 20s, maybe 21, 22. I was never a big drinker, but at that age, in my new ID to be able to go to bars and my new friend group, then all of a sudden I really enjoyed it. Back then, I loved drinking. It made me so confident, so energized, so euphoric, so happy. We'd have so much fun, just amazing. And at that age, with the really healthy liver, I hadn't been abusing it for long. I did a bunch of weed since I was 15, but, I was really healthy, surfing a lot, swimming, hacky sack, bike riding, skateboarding. So I wouldn't get hangovers. I'd wake up feeling great at that age after heavy nights of drinking. So at the beginning, there was no way any intervention would have got me to quit. I was loving it. But then as time goes on, for some people, it happens in weeks or months. For most people, it probably takes a year or several years or a decade or longer for some people. Eventually, the positive benefits and go down, the negative consequences go up. Then at that point, shit starts to hit the fan. Wait, now the negative consequences outweigh the positive benefits. Now alcohol and or drug use has a net deficit, is putting a net deficit towards their quality of life. At that point, typically people's intrinsic motivation will go up higher. And then it's just all about, if they're still stuck at that point, that's when it's time to hammer home, write a list of all the different incentives that they can create for themselves. And like you were saying towards the beginning, being intentional. How many people wake up and just kind of live in reaction throughout the day and, go on their phone and they know certain few things they have to do and do them. But how many people wake up each day and start the day visualizing a really crisp, clear picture of what they would like their life to look like, what they would like their health and their emotions and their relationships and their career, finances, business, relationship with their kids, recreation, traveling. How many people even write down a paragraph on that and look at it every day? How many people write a whole page, review it every morning, close their eyes, and feel the feelings of what that future vision is like? That's like the meta habit of all habits right there. It's a meta habit because you do that every single morning, and it activates the reticular activating system in your brain, which is like a heat-seeking missile, to search for everything, the people, the situations, the experiences, the books, the ideas, the concepts, the foods, everything that's going to help you achieve that vision without programming your subconscious and your reticular activating system, the RAS or RAS. You're just living life like, I think Jim Rohn put it this way before. Imagine a big, huge ship out at sea that has no goal or destination, and that's just floating out there. That's what the majority of people in the world are doing. They're a ship out in the middle of the sea. There's no compass. They haven't set the sail to any outcome, to any destination. Oh my gosh, that makes it so much harder. That was the majority of my life. Well, a large portion of my life, until when I was 32, started to learn from Tony Robbins and Wayne Dyer, and then eventually, now by this point, thousands of people. And that's still one of the skills that I use on a very daily or consistent basis, is like, okay, where are we going? And you and I have these mastermind calls and of like where we want to take things in the future for the podcast and for other things. And, you know, it's fun. And then you do lots of vision casting too. Vision casting, like in 6 months, this is how things are going to be. And in 12 months with fit recovery. And so that's very motivating. So a lot of people don't have people vision casting for them what their life's going to look like on a constant basis. That means that we need to be our own vision caster. We have to cast our own vision. We don't have anyone else doing it for us. Plus, we don't want anyone else casting our vision for us. It's our fucking life. If you don't have intentions and goals and visions for your life, you're usually going to fall in line to doing other people's intentions and goals and visions for their life.
That's a great point. And I would add that since vision casting is so important, since it's so important to regain the ability to fully trust your own mind, we have some serious flaws with the overarching system in which most extrinsic and intrinsic incentives are framed, because the prevailing dogma tells us that with addiction, you're either going to go through your life as an addict and probably die or end up in jail or in an institution, or you're going to be giving up ownership essentially of your own life's direction because you can't trust your stinking thinking. And you are going to have to surrender that to your sponsor or people who are helping you out and have continual support. And you can't really trust your own mind again because the disease is strong and it's going to lead you astray. So I think that's a serious problem. I don't agree with anything I just said. I was just trying to lay out the prevailing wisdom. I think a lot of people feel trapped by that. And that is a huge source of resentment for people, because if you feel as if not only that you don't want to vision cast because you're not ready, but that you fundamentally can't because you're defective, then you have a serious problem. And you may as well go drink or use drugs, because the alternative is pretty bleak too. So I think that false dichotomy there, or at least the idea that you can't trust your own mind, which seems to be, I don't really see that as being a necessary interpretation of 12-step philosophy, but it seems to be the prevailing interpretation among most rehab centers for reasons I won't get into. But if I could go back and talk to myself in very early recovery, I would give myself a logical breakdown of why that doesn't make sense, because I was very worried about whether or not I'd ever be able to truly regain control of my life. I was taught that control was a bad word. When I wanted to control things, that's when I would realize that I don't have control, and I would quote relapse. That didn't turn out to be true. As I recovered, as I fixed biochemical imbalances, as I began to get more mental clarity, as I got more fit, as I built my self-efficacy, I learned that I could trust my mind more than ever after addiction. And that doesn't mean that I became omniscient or that I always made the best choices. But when I didn't make good choices, or if I was wrong about something, at least I would be clear-minded enough to correct course a bit more quickly. So I think it's important for people to know that you should vision cast for yourself, if a life beyond alcohol or addiction is something that you decide you want. And also to know that it is something that you have the capacity to do. And if you feel like you can't do it right now because you're in the midst of an alcohol binge or a drug binge or whatever, do know that with biochemical repair, which is what you and I both recommend as the first focal point for trying to overcome addiction, with biochemical repair, you will absolutely get back to a state of mental clarity. And for those who might not know, biochemical repair refers to targeted supplementation and diet changes and lifestyle changes to try to get rid of the toxins that you might have in your body especially from alcohol, the most toxic drug there is probably, and also to allow all of the systems in your body to start functioning properly, most notably the brain.
Yeah, I mean, and then, for if you are just listening to this podcast for the first time, or if you're still relatively new, I recommend going back and listening to, we've got, almost 230 episodes now. Chris and I have done so many different topics, things like the hierarchy of recovery, the phases of recovery. And of course, we've also had tremendous and plentiful guests on the show as well. It takes time. It takes some time investment. If you're not used to like listening to long 45-minute, hour-long things, if your thing's more like short YouTube videos, 5, 10, 15-minute videos, I would just say give it a shot doing some of the, 45-minute, hour-long episodes. To make it quicker, you can even do it at, 1.5 speed, 2 speed. That's usually, or even faster in some cases. That's what I usually do. But where I'm going with this is, and Chris, you're a big fan of this too, is skill stacking and resource stacking. So the reason I had so many failed attempts at getting long-term recovery back in the day was I didn't have many skills and I didn't have a lot of resources. And the resources that I did have, I rarely, not very often utilized. So this past time now, I had things like loving family, non-judgmental, compassionate family support. I rekindled, ties with my old AA sponsor, and he was real supportive for that, for the first, 2 months. I really needed a lot of support those first 2 months, especially the first month. I had, Papaya, would you be quiet? I'm doing a podcast here, Birdie. Ashley must be taking a nap, and now she's freaking out. Papaya, fly in here if you want. Come here. Either fly in here or be quiet. But skill stacking, so skills, things like, knowing how to exercise, there's, journaling, writing goals, writing intentions. Those are all skills. Papaya, be quiet. And then a resource stacking. So all of a sudden I had, family. That's a great social resource right there. All of a sudden I had biochemical restoration therapies. Just by serendipity, one of my family members sent down some great amino acid supplements, like here, this one's for dopamine and endorphins, and this one's for GABA. My mom was making me herbal nervine teas and giving me magnesium. So I had biochemical restoration. I was getting fresh air in Southern California by the ocean and up the hill overlooking the ocean. And I had a pet at the time. I had a dog that I was walking. Just so many different things that finally I had the resources and the incentives, both intrinsic and extrinsic, and a little bit of time without too many stressful things. I was able to utilize that proactively, because if I didn't do it at that point, I don't think I was ever going to be able to do it. It was do or die for me. It was just so crazy to not relapse after my overdose. And so, yeah, resource stacking. Chris, what do you think about resource stacking? Also skill stacking, system modeling, such as the hierarchy of recovery and our phases of recovery. There's a lot to learn. I'm going to get Papaya.
I think it's an important thing for anyone listening to know that this was a long evolution for both of us. So, we didn't suddenly at the 2-month mark in early recovery decide that we would subscribe to the biopsychosocial spiritual model of addiction recovery, and that we would have all of these skills that we would work on that would ultimately bring us out of our addictions. A lot of it was unplanned and a lot of it was going with the flow, but trying to intelligently go with the flow. And a lot of the skills that I stacked, so to speak, I got from books that I picked up by serendipity. A friend would loan me a book, or I would see something on Amazon and click buy. That was the case with Tony Robbins, with some of the old books, Dale Carnegie, Michael Singer, I believe, and that was on your recommendation, and on and on and on. So many things: books on breathing, books on sleep, books on exercise, books on fat loss, nutrition, neuroscience, psychology, philosophy, the philosophy of mind, psychedelics, and then addiction, which is funny enough. I've read a lot of books on addiction, but my favorite books for addiction actually didn't even mention addiction. A lot of them, they were just kind of tangential offshoots for whatever skills or knowledge I was interested in accumulating at that time. So I'd say immerse yourself in podcasts, this one, hopefully, but others as well. And in subjects that interest you. I listened to health and fitness podcasts, self-improvement podcasts. We both listen to Joe Rogan, lots of interesting authors and nutrition people and athletes and CEOs and everything else. And just pursue what interests you authentically. And I think you're bound to stack skills and knowledge that's going to be useful for whatever it is that you want to do. Whether a lot of people have careers that they don't hate, unlike me or maybe you, they don't need a career shift, but they want to have a more open mind, or they want to contribute more, or they want to find a way to spend their time that makes them feel more fulfilled. So I think the same strategy holds. And, another aspect of my compulsive personality has been that I have to read every night before I go to sleep. So that's resulted in that large bookcase filled with books about disparate topics. That's no longer the background of my podcast, but people sometimes ask, did you really read all those books? And the answer is, yeah, I've read probably 97% of those books because I have to read before I go to sleep. And I feel like there's a huge benefit of reading before you go to sleep, especially if it's something you're interested in. Sometimes I'll review my MMA notes, mixed martial arts notes from that. I've started to build an outline of the various things I've learned. And I find that when I go to sleep, I'm more likely to dream about that and have these like cool interactive dreams, like I'm plugged into a simulation, which we all might be anyway, but it's like I'm plugged into this dream simulation where I'm reinforcing the things that I read right before I went to sleep. I think it was Bruce Lipton in The Biology of Belief, who he points out that the most malleable times for your subconscious are right before bed and right when you wake up in the morning, hence the importance of an evening routine and a morning routine. I don't tend to read so much in the morning. I like to write down lists of things that excite me and that I want to get done that day or in general. But at night, I love to read before bed. And that's really what led me towards gathering the disparate skills that have helped me, I guess you could say, stay on track. But I don't really even think about alcohol except to the extent that Fit Recovery revolves around alcohol a bit. And I'm thinking about helping people. But it's helped me do things that I definitely didn't imagine I could do before I quit drinking.
Oh, this is going full circle. Talking about reading something, learning something in that way by reading before bed. My psychology teacher back in college, forget his name, but he was a great teacher. He was a psychologist. He had a PhD. He taught just that one evening class, and then he had a private practice where he would mostly help parents to learn how to control their children with mostly positive reinforcement. And he recommended this great book to me too. I forget what the name of it is now, something about behavior. But anyways, it was about positive reinforcement for kids. And that revolutionized the way I parented. It was like reduce or eliminate all criticism. And then just every time you notice your child doing something that you want that behavior to increase, enforce it, give them a compliment, give them a little prize, give them something, give them a star on a board. So the criticism goes way down or all the way off. And then the positive reinforcement goes way up. And the class that I was in of his was, I think, called Learning and Behavior, which was on things like schedules of reinforcement, incentives, that type of thing, and why humans behave in the way they do. We studied a lot of pigeon stuff and mice studies and all that fun stuff. But yeah, it went full circle. I did have some other things that were really cool that I want to talk about based on your awesome little talk there. But now that I've forgotten them, oh yeah, one final thing, and then I think that's it for me. Talking about resources for recovery, I think when I started to talk about resources, that's why Papaya, she was like, hey, buddy, you left me out. I was talking about family. Papaya, I was talking about when when I detoxed and got better, almost a decade ago. You weren't around back then. So something that makes my life way better, makes me give a rat's ass about, ever getting back into addictive lifestyle like that. Papaya is one of my best resources. Animals, pet therapy. Chris, you got those 2 beautiful dogs. And then even like when I'm not hanging out with Papaya, which is pretty rare because I work from home, she's with me a lot and we cuddle and we do so many fun things around the home and outside. But there's 2 channels. One's called The Dodo on YouTube, and another one is Geo Beats Animals or Geo Beat Animals. In the morning time, sometimes in the morning when I'm like, oh, I'm tired, let my supplements start kicking in, start hydrating. When I have like no energy when I first get up and I'm kind of just, especially this week, Willow just started school. I went from sleeping until 7:30 to 8:30 a.m. to waking up a little after 6:15. And then, getting her ready for school, packing her lunch, driving in all the dang traffic to take her to school, dropping her off, and then driving back on the traffic. And it's not even a far distance, but all the kids are going to school, all the parents in buses driving. Then I get home and it's almost 8 a.m. So I'm like, oh, I'll start watching some animal videos. They got these adorable videos of cats, dogs. Lots of them are rescue videos of rescue pets, but there's birds and squirrels, like any animal you can think of that's like kind of common pets or even uncommon pets or rescues. So yeah, pets are a great resource. We'll have to do an episode fully on that in the near future and do some research on the actual, the research benefits. I know what the benefits are for me. She raises my vibration, my vibratory state feels lighter and more uplifted and more blissful and joyful if I'm with her and then watching some animal videos versus watching something that's like fear, 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 pandemic, 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 new virus variant, vaccine this. Oh, we're all going to die if you don't do this. And, and I won't go into it, but look at how the government's going right now. They are there's like incentives, both intrinsic and extrinsic incentives for lots of different things with the government, even like paying your taxes early to the IRS. You get some extrinsic incentives, save some money. So I'll shut up now.
Right. Yeah. Well, I've got these 2 beautiful dogs passed out here because we went for a dog jog earlier, right before this podcast, and they also went to the dog park. Eyes open when I said that. Magnus is here.
Resource stacking. You went outside, exercised with your pets. Nature, sunlight, therapy, pets, exercise. That's at least 4.
Yeah, you're right. I'm stacking getting all sorts of benefits. If I wear my earthing sandals for the run, then I'm earthing as well, and getting fresh air and sun and the dog therapy. But I've realized I can't swing kettlebells with them around because they want to hang out, and it could be catastrophic if it's a heavy kettlebell. But yeah, I was going to see if I can get my webcam and say hi to Magnus for a second.
I so dig your.
There he is. Hey, Magnus.
Oh my goodness! Right on the trampoline.
Right on the rebounder. Yep. And then we'll see if we can get Freya. Hey, Freya.
Oh my goodness.
Hey, Freya. Oh, we got a twitch.
Don't wake him up.
That's all we got. That's all we got.
Yeah, talk about raising the vibration of your whole entire home, with pets laying around like that, loving things like having essential oil diffusers, animals, beautiful pictures and, nice kind of designs, mood lights, environmental optimization, which we've done a full episode on in the past, optimizing your home for addiction recovery.
Well, and now, I have my comfy pajamas on, which now everyone knows who's watching the YouTube, as I was trying to adjust my camera back there. But yeah, I'm a big fan of maintaining good vibes. And, before all this research came out, for example, and then we can end it after this because this could be a long podcast, but I got Himalayan salt lamps and started dimming lights at night because I thought I was weird and just obsessed with the vibe and the mood lighting. And then it turns out later, all this research comes out about like ancestral considerations for reducing light after the time at which our hunter-gatherer ancestors would not have seen light, and the benefits of red light therapy, and so it's pretty funny. I just went with my gut instinct for some of those things. So if you ever have something like that where you think, I really like this tea, or I really like this routine at night, there could well be research that comes out in several years and vindicates you. So I'm a big fan of intuitive lifestyle design.
Yeah, that's what's up. Instead of like, oh, I don't know if it's evidence-based. I don't know if there's scientific research. Does it make you feel lighter and happier and more joyous and blissful and more relaxed? Or does it make you feel denser and darker and heavier and more fearful, angry? That's the vibration. I want to go into this Healthline article on vibratory energy medicine. But anyways, we'll save that for a future one. Thanks so much, Chris. Thanks so much, viewers and listeners. We love you guys. Thanks so much for being a part of this Elevation Recovery Tribe and Fit Recovery Tribe. And we'll see you next time. Papaya, Matt, and Chris out.